Welcome to this webinar. I'm John Strickland in London.
And welcome, I'm Daniel Snapperson from Reykjavik.
And I'm Louis Dejoux in New York.
This is the second in a series from Reperio and JLS Consulting. We took a look at the beginning of the year at the state of the North Atlantic market. And we'd already had some pretty positive reports from US carriers about their year end and the outlook. We've since heard from the European majors in the last few weeks, but the world has changed, as we speak today, with the start of conflict at the beginning of March in the Gulf region. So that has changed our perspective on the way ahead. Now, everybody would like certainty, everybody would like black and white answers. What we want to do is avoid wild speculation, but we want to put our heads together and look at what we can tell at this point in time. We know that the majors reported strong results, but Daniel, tell us a bit more about what they said.
As you said earlier, the year started off very strong with the United saying, the revenue momentum was so strong. AIG also said focus particularly on the North and South Atlantic market, saying that they were going to perform more strong in Q1, and then Delta was the first one to report early January or 16th of January, if I remember correctly. They were also on the same wavelength as the others. So they're all positive when the year started, like they did last year as well. But of course, last year was a little bit up and down, whereas they ended up at the strongly at the end. So in general, very strong sentiment among the airlines.
And in fact, the sentiment was only just expressed a matter of days before we saw the beginning of the conflict in the Gulf. And of course, one of the immediate things that then transpired was we saw the price of oil jump up to extremely high levels. And I think it's worth us taking a look at that in the long term. The industry is not unfamiliar with oil prices going up, but how does it look, Daniel, if we look back over time?
Yeah, so this is a chart showing the price of jet fuel in nominal terms going back to the 1990s. And as you can see that there have been spikes like this in the past. Back in 2008, just around the financial crisis, there was quite a big spike in fuel prices. Same likewise in 2022 when the war in Ukraine started. And as you can see now, the prices are at around $1,400 per ton. One thing to note is that there's quite a big difference between the regions. So the price of jet fuel in Europe is much more expensive than in North America. That's because of supply constraints and issues like that. So it's interesting what's happening now with the fuel price.
Well, another big difference, of course, is the position of the carriers to face this right now. We saw from those year-end results that the European majors are all pretty well hedged, certainly in the coming months, very high levels of hedging at some pretty low market rates, maybe Lufthansa in the lead in terms of that protection. That's quite a contrast to the US carriers, which philosophically for a number of years just have not got into hedging. So they're exposed immediately. So the response to this cost increase, given that oil even before this new challenge emerged would be at least 25 to 30% of typical airline costs. The response could be quite different, with more pressure arguably on US carriers for fare increases or surcharges being put in place. So what do we think about this?
You can see that the airlines are already starting to act, by raising prices. And the biggest question is whether the demand will hold up there. That's the biggest question.
Louis, you were going to add something there.
Yeah, in the US market, you're right to say that US carriers have given up on hedging a long time ago. Typically, what they see are fare increases in the domestic market whenever fuel price goes up. And so that's a mechanism that we expect to see taking place here in the US.
So given this difference in outlook, is most typical of American consumers against the already weak European demand, how do we see this perhaps shaping up in the coming weeks and months?
From a demand point of view, I think there's three buckets. First of all, business travel, which we know is sensitive to budget cuts and any cost increases that corporates are seeing. The second big is vacation travel, leisure travel, traditional leisure travel, and that can be impacted by disposable income, oil prices, as well as consumer psychology. Do they feel confident to go abroad? And indeed, we know that in past crises, there's been a significant slowdown. Last but not least, I think one of the part of the demand which is most resilient is visiting friends and relatives. We saw that throughout COVID. People still want to hug their grandmas. And so that's a type of demand that I expect to see more resilience in the next few months in all scenarios of demand.
I think it's a very interesting point, Louis, because certainly it was, the savior, you could say, for airlines as we started to come out of the pandemic and people could travel again. That is definitely the strongest reason for people
That's right.
traveling, as you said,
That's
to
right.
visit
Yeah, that's right.
grandma, visiting the grandkids.
That's
Let's
right.
now put this in a bit more context now. I mean, we are talking North Atlantic, but what has happened since this conflict began? We've seen the Gulf carriers, who are now a key part of our aviation landscape, having to cut capacity. And what does that mean? Does it have any relevance to the North Atlantic market? Of course, it does in a number of ways. But Louis, set the scene in terms of what the Gulf carriers mean today and how it's relevant to our discussion right now.
Yeah, you're right. The Gulf carriers, the Middle East three, the super connectors, as sometimes they're called, play a vital role in long haul connectivity in many markets. You can see here on the screen different routings to go from North America to India, which, by the way, is a massive market. And what you can see on the slide is that the best, in theory, the best hub to go from North America to India is actually Helsinki. Dubai is very close with only a 5% distance penalty. And indeed, the Gulf carriers have taken advantage of that great position to create a very strong fleet and schedule proposition for that big market. And so, with the Gulf carriers' capacity currently down, that creates a lot of pressures on supply and demand. And so, what we're already seeing are North American carriers adding non-stop capacity from North America to India.
Where are we
For
seeing that,
context,
Louis?
we're seeing Air Canada recently adding a second daily flight from Toronto to India. And so that's something that we see quite a bit. We're also seeing a lot of bookings that we haven't seen in the past. So we're seeing some really interesting things going on. People need to go from A to B. And when Dubai, Doha, and Abu Dhabi are closed, people are looking for alternative gateways. United reported recently that they're now taking up to 1,000 bookings a day from Europe to Australia, New Zealand. We also know that people are going through Tokyo, Seoul. So it's very interesting to see how the global hubs all compete with each other. And when there's a big capacity issue, we're going to see some reroutings that are very interesting. And that may drive airline capacity if the situation continues indeed.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a really interesting situation, isn't it? Because, as you said, for example, the Indian diaspora, both US, East Coast, Midwest, West Coast, that was using the Gulf hub so substantially in the absence of very much non-stop capacity. That travel doesn't want to just stop. It wants to find a way. So, as you said, it could go transatlantic via European points. It could go across the Pacific. Airlines will be looking, of course, in the really important, critical North Atlantic market about local demand. But it doesn't necessarily mean that if there's any more softness there, that they pull capacity off, because it could be needed for these kind of flows that are rerouting. But it also makes the point that in the absence of Gulf carriers, airlines who see themselves, European carriers, for example, with capacity displaced, but would go to the Gulf, what do they do? And we've also heard, for example, from Lufthansa and British Airways recently adding a limited number of flights to points in Asia, I think in the case of Lufthansa, even to some points in Africa, to compensate for that loss of enormous lift by the Gulf carriers. And thinking 500,000 people a day were going through those Gulf hubs before this conflict hit.
That's right. And Israel, Tel Aviv is also a big destination for European carriers and US carriers. And the opening or closure of Tel Aviv as a market has got a big impact on available fleet.
Absolutely. So let's move on and take a look at some other factors in the market. We've said already that some airlines are raising fares, the fuel surcharges are coming in. Others have said at the moment they're going to hold tight, particularly the European carriers, because of the fact that they are well hedged. Bookings, maybe we're still in the early stages. Of course, a lot of people would have booked for the summer, but we're still in that booking build-up phase. And not surprisingly, investors are focusing on margins, not just traffic. I mean, things looked more rosy until this conflict hit. Any observations from either of you you'd like to bring in on this selection of points?
Yeah, for example, Air New Zealand, they announced they will be cutting some flights. I think they said 5% of their network. Although they also said that they will not be cutting any flights to US because of the people are finding alternative ways to get to Europe via the US. And they actually said that this is because of higher fuel price. So then the US carriers have been asked about the booking flows, and they're still happy with that. So but I guess the key question, as we highlight at the bottom of this slide, is that will they be able to pass through the higher fuel cost through to the customer? That's the key question out there.
And let's build on that with our next slide, because we actually have talked in our last webinar about the real importance of premium traffic. The year-end figures, particularly from people like IAG and Air France-KLM, pointed up just how much that traffic was buoyant, a very good outlook in terms of people who wish to travel, and capacity being invested in that as well. But as we see here, that does combine with what we already mentioned about sentiment. Louis, do you want to comment on some of those factors?
Look, yeah, my intuition is that premium travel, premium demand is more volatile than economy demand because, as we discussed, visiting friends and relatives demand tends to be more stable and predictable. And so we could see some volatility in the revenue, the top line of airlines worldwide. It all depends on consumer confidence and the outlook for companies across the world.
Now, you're in the US, Louis. I mean, you see day to day. I mean, the US consumer is seeing, gas prices at the pumps going up. They'd had pressures and uncertainties from tariff activity. What is your reading so far of this so important US market sentiment?
People are starting to see the impact in real life with on social media, many people posting photos of their gas tank bill, which often goes above $100 now. So that's really creating a real impact in people's lives. I also feel that psychologically, any overseas conflict can deter long-haul demand. And so I believe that might be an opportunity for domestic destinations, as well as destinations closer to home, because the Caribbean, Canada, potentially Mexico, which was also in the news cycle for some challenges about 10 days ago. And so that's where we are.
And let's take a look more from the airline side, Daniel, with our next set of headlines. I mean, you've been a network planner yourself very recently, and a lot of exposure to the North Atlantic market. What do you imagine airlines are thinking right now in the North Atlantic market, given the kind of factors we're talking about here?
Yeah, I'm fairly sure there's someone sitting in a headquarters somewhere in Europe and North America with a big spreadsheet or a system looking at, which, if this situation is going to prolong and last, then, they will have to make some cuts to capacity, cut out marginal flying, flying that doesn't cover the variable cost like fuel and overflight charges and airport cost, etc. Of course, the capacity that is probably going to be taken out first is the weakest flying, sort of off-peak days, but they will try to protect the strong markets. With North Atlantic has been very strong historically in recent years for the carriers. So we're not expecting any major moves there, in the short term. But we never know, as it all depends on how long the situation is going to last. And then, of course, another third thing we'll probably be looking at this, and then we've seen other carriers, saying they're going to be raising surcharges and trying to move these higher costs onto the consumer.
I mean, the one that I really wrestle with in all of this, and the early stage at which we're at in being able to pick through the haze, the fog, if you like, in the crystal ball, is that if we think about the European carriers who have aircraft displaced from the Gulf, I mean, an airline like BA would normally be using 5, 6, 7 wide bodies a day. on routes to, for example, Dubai. They announced the early termination of their Abu Dhabi service before the winter season was even finished. The logical thing for them normally would be to put capacity into the North Atlantic, but as we've said, there could be demand for Asia too. But then the North Atlantic does hold good for some carriers on some gateways, particularly places like California, where you can go through West Pacific services to places like Australia and New Zealand, probably some of the bigger hubs on the East Coast, not necessarily for all city pairs. I mean, it's quite a difficult one to work out, isn't it, gentlemen?
Yeah, that's right. And to some extent, it's a new deal of cards that the airlines have been given now. There's areas of weakness, areas of strengths, and a very dynamic situation. One of the positive side effects of COVID is that airlines have learned how to be very nimble, replan their network really quickly, develop processes and tools to change a network at short notice. And that's something that's really going to help the industry as airlines take advantage of new pockets of demand.
And as we talk today, I mean, even outside of the North Atlantic, there's certainly been examples of airlines operating into markets that they wouldn't normally operate from. I've heard of airlines in the Indian Ocean region operating flights to Europe because they have displaced passengers who would have gone via the Gulf. I've heard of another couple from points in Asia operating direct into Europe by airlines that are not even from that region because they have aircraft and crews available. So it could be certainly like a microcosm, as you said, of experience of the pandemic in the coming weeks and months.
That's right. And I certainly hope that governmental red tape won't prevent the airlines from being nimble and keeping the world open for commerce and trade.
Absolutely. So let's just come back to the North Atlantic as we draw our little discussion today to a close. Of course, higher fuel does increase risk, but more so arguably for those US carriers. But perhaps it's worth saying the US carriers, their share of capacity allocated to the North Atlantic is less than their European cohorts, because of course, what we touched on already, the large domestic market and a lot of their Latin American and Pacific exposure. So there's a difference there. But capacity, as we're saying on the slide here, is important. Daniel.
Yeah. I mean, capacity is key because that produces all the cost, and unfortunately, a lot of the cost now is increased because of the higher fuel. But one thing that the North Atlantic market does have going for it is that there's fairly at the moment fairly modest planned increase in capacity this year versus last year, about 2%. And then just shy of 2% if you just look at the peak summer, June, July, August. So there's some, capacity discipline is there at the moment. But of course, if the fuel is going to be at these high prices, then the carriers might have to make some adjustments.
And Louis, as we've said here again, we talked about premium demand, which you said is maybe a bit more suspect, even though it's been the bedrock. We don't know what exactly will happen with that in the coming weeks and months.
That's right. We're going to look at corporate budgets. We're going to look at wallets in the hand of different Americans by income brackets, how that's being evolving, and consumer sentiment indeed. I know a lot of folks in the travel industry, tour operator, cruise lines will be encouraging people, of course, to keep their bookings. Europe is safe, Europe is open. And the appetite for summer holidays in Europe for Americans has been a huge part of the post-COVID recovery, and I would hope this will continue in 2026.
And it's worth mentioning that during the back in 2022, when the Ukraine war started, which of course is a conflict that's much closer to Central Europe, Western Europe than what's happening now. There was no real impact on bookings. Of course, albeit the market was coming from the lows of the pandemic, so it was still recovering, and there was this pent up demand and premium leisure. But whereas now we're more in a stable environment, if you call it like that. So, but it's interesting times for sure.
Yeah, that's one way of putting it, Daniel. Interesting times. Maybe not the right kind of interest that we would wish to have. I think what we've talked about just now has shown, the whole variety of considerations and complexities as we as individuals and as airlines pick their way through so many unknown elements. And I think if we sum up, at least the industry is used to being flexible, became much more used to being so in the pandemic. But only time is going to tell how this shapes up. So, the positive, I suppose, is we're moving into the peak summer season when the wish to travel is that much stronger. And as we put this out into the public domain, we are obviously hopeful that the conflict is more short and long-lived, and that we also see stability return in oil prices. But any final comments that either of you would like to make before we close up today's webinar?
I think, as you said, John, the Gulf carriers play such a big role in the global aviation industry. And so we hope that operations resume soon.
I think our debate today has shown the depth and variety and complexity of the challenges facing the industry right now as a result of this conflict in the Gulf. We all hope it is one which is more short-lived and long-lived, that oil supplies become stabilized, consumer confidence, which has been riding on a high, recovers, and that we do indeed see the buoyant summer that we hope for. But we hope that what we've talked about has provided you with some insight based on our own industry experience, is helpful in shaping thinking for the weeks and months ahead. Please do come back to us with any comments or suggestions about our discussion today or for future discussions. So for now, from me, John Strickland, it's goodbye. And from my colleagues, Louis and Daniel as well.
Thank you so much.
Very good.